When it comes to feature flags, I'm a little bit of a super fan. I think that feature flags are amazing. I think that they have completely revolutionized the way products get developed, and I can't imagine building products without feature flags. And over the years, I've cultivated a sense of best practices about how I like to apply feature flags. And one of the things that I like to do is in an API response to a single page application, so not a multi-page application where a user is getting a fresh page on every navigation, but in a single page application context where there is a long running client-side process that's making API calls back to the ColdFusion server. One of the things that I like to do in my API response is return a set of flags or permissions or whatever you want to call it that help dictate how the client-side code is supposed to render the user experience. So in this demo, imagine that this is our API and this is our long-running client-side process. What I'm doing just for the simulation is I'm taking this API response, and down here at the bottom, I'm encoding it as a JSON here, and I'm parsing it, and then I'm using an immediately invoked function expression to send it to here my apply API response. So this is going to simulate an API response from our server, which is really just the ColdFusion code at the top. And in this case, we're rendering a contact detail page. And one of the features that we're building is the ability to duplicate a contact. And we want to build that behind a feature flag, so we don't actually want to show the duplicate contact call to action to all of our users. We only want to show it to our developers initially, and then maybe once it's developed to a cohort of users who can test it out for us. So right now, you'll see that the feature flags can see duplicate is set to false. And if we look at our code here, the call to action defaults to being hidden from the user experience. And then in our API response handler, we're checking to see if the feature flags .can see duplicate is a truthy. And if it's a truthy, we change that display to block. So let's just render the initial experience here. Let's jump over to the browser and let's refresh. And you can see that we have our contact duplicate call to action here, display none. That's what we expected to see. If I were to leave and come back, you can see it continues to be hidden. So let's go ahead now and flip this to true. And if we refresh the page, voila, there is our duplicate contact. You can see that the display has been switched to block. So that's how that works in the development process. But now let's jump forward to the end of development, the end of validation. We have the feature built. We're ready to roll the feature out to all of our users. They can see it. We've turned the flag on. The targeting hits everybody. And now it's time to clean up our code. Cleaning up the code means removing the feature flag from the code, removing that branching logic, removing the cruft that is associated with feature flags. Feature flags are without doubt amazing, but they do add complexity, and that complexity needs to be minimized over time. So when you commit to a feature, you have to remove it from the code. So let's say as a developer, I'm coming through and I'm looking at my server-side code, and I'm saying, oh, this duplicate feature is now rolled out to the application. Let's remove it from the code. We can send back an empty feature flags set. And now what happens is this user, who remember is in a single page application, meaning that this client-side code doesn't update on every single navigation. This client-side code might exist in the user's browser for days or weeks or even months. And now imagine that, again, we've removed the feature flag from our ColdFusion API response, and the user goes to refresh, and suddenly that option to duplicate the contact is gone. What happened here? What happened is that if we look down at our client-side code, which remember is part of a long-running process, this can see duplicate property is no longer true. It's actually undefined. And we can log this out here. Let's copy, do a little copy pasta. And if we refresh the page and look at our console, you'll see that it's undefined. And that's because we removed the key from the server-side code, but the client-side code is part of a long-running process and has not yet been updated to remove the branching logic around this feature flag. To fix this, what we want to do is create a feature flag that what I call fails open. Meaning instead of looking at this like a truthy value, what we want to do is actually check explicitly to make sure that it is not false. So let's go back and let's turn this back on here. So actually, let's go back to false. So now we're going to send back a false, like the feature flag is being hidden for this user. and we're checking to see that it's not false. So that means that it'll remain hidden for the user, right? So let's refresh. We can see that it is not there. That's to be expected. Now let's go back in. Let's change this to true. Feature flag development's been done. We're turning it on for all users. Voila. They see the action the way that we wanted to see the action. Now let's imagine that we've committed to the feature flag. We want it to be present for all users. So we go ahead and we remove this code from our server side logic. At this point, even though we still have a long running process here, and we're no longer returning the can see duplicate feature flag, if I refresh the page, you'll note that I still see the duplicate contact call to action. And that's because at this point, the can see duplicate value is undefined like we saw earlier, and undefined is not a strict equals, is not a strict disequals to false. So essentially, the client-side code now operates in 3 distinct states: an explicit true, an explicit false, and an undefined. And both the explicit true and the undefined fail to match on false, allowing this feature to, what I call, again, fail open if the can see duplicate is not present in the API response. And that allows us to build more resilient client-side code that can work more synergistically with the way that we manage that state on the server side with the feature flag targeting. So this is something that I've learned over the last 6 or 7 years of using feature flags, and this has really made a big difference. It took me quite a number of years to come to this conclusion, and I'm finally happy that I've codified it in my head as such.